Stand for me?
NATO, NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's still around, so it is important. I mean, it's the treaty, the nations in the North Atlantic includes the United States, Canada, and Great Britain, and France, and I believe Spain, and the Scandinavian countries, and Italy, and Turkey, and Greece, all members of NATO. All right. Your book opens up with a vignette about a debate. Now, I want to say this before we start. From what I'm teaching from here on out, folks, is stuff that I personally remember. And I was 10 years old when Richard Nixon, actually I was still 9, Richard Nixon visited Russia. And he got in this heated debate with Khrushchev that I've got to say Nixon really didn't start. But Nixon carried along an American kitchen. In this American kitchen, he carried along a refrigerator, an electric range or stove, a dishwasher, and a garbage collector, and all these nice conveniences, and an electric mixer, all this stuff that practically every American woman had in her kitchen. So he carried along, he was showing off to Khrushchev, this is how our women live. And something he said got under Khrushchev's skin, and Khrushchev began cussing. It said it made the interpreter blush, Nixon's interpreter blush, to try to explain to Nixon what Khrushchev was saying in the Russian language. Nixon was simply taken aback. What he said that set Khrushchev off, but really what was going on in Russia was they were so short on housing that they had about 2 and sometimes 3 families living in a house, the same house. And one of their astronauts, Titov, who orbited Earth 17 times, got, catches 3 whole rooms in the apartment just for him and his family. Yeah, 3 whole rooms just for himself. I mean, isn't that great? That's what he got as reward, because the Russians were really overcrowded for housing. And Khrushchev was very upset, but Nixon would point out how, no, the Russians, the people did not live near to the standard we did. And again, it was this exchange was known as the kitchen debate. In the end, both men apologized. I mean, Khrushchev had guaranteed Nixon a safe trip. So in the end, both men apologized, and they went on their merry way. Nixon was much more careful, and the interpreter with Nixon was much more careful what he said. Nixon was trying to groom himself to run for president, to take Ike's place. All right. Eisenhower did not repeal the New Deal, but he did not expand on it. You know, basically Eisenhower left Social Security in place and left the FDIC in place, but he did not get up any new further New Deal programs. He did not believe the federal government had any business taking care of health care. The federal government should not aid education, and he did not believe the federal government should end racial segregation. But one thing he is remembered for, and every time you get on the interstate, you'll see this, maybe not every time, but most of the time, you'll see 5 stars in a pentagon. Ike was a 5-star general. And it says underneath Eisenhower Interstate System. He signed into law the Eisenhower Interstate System. He had seen this in Europe, particularly in Germany. And Hitler, in preparation for war, had built a bunch of turnpikes called Autobahns. And if you're ever in Germany, any Autobahn, there are no speed limits. The road goes for miles straight as a board. Vroom! I see one person like look like you've seen it. Straight, and then before you get to a curve, they'll warn you a curve is coming. And you've got 2 miles to slow down, then you go to the curve, curve around the curve, then you gun your engine all and do 130, 140, anything you can get. And yeah, they do have people get killed on those things. But Eisenhower did not copy that. We in America do not allow more than 70 miles an hour. For many years we only allowed 55, but we don't allow more than 70. And persons who go faster than that can expect to get pulled over. Talked to my daughter for a couple of years, my wife did too, and one day she saw some blue lights flashing behind her. More than $100 fine. If he'd have put a figure 2 miles higher than it did, she could have lost her license right there on the first offense. She was going 18 miles an hour over the limit. Serious business, folk.
I heard that some roads in Texas are above 70 miles per hour.
That might be true out west. Again, their roads are straighter than ours. Actually, at one point out west, they didn't have limits. The federal government eventually imposed it. When I was a kid, out west, they didn't have any limits. And you could go any speed your car could go. Yeah, okay, that might be right. But here in the east, the roads are more crowded. And most people today have slowed down. Not everybody. But anyway, I set up the interstate highway system. Now here's where your book is going. You're going to find your authors taking views that I do not hold. Your authors will state that the highways led to more pollution, more energy consumption, and a decline in mass transportation, and a decay in central cities. Folk, if you really want to save the planet, drive on the interstate rather than drive on these 30-mile-an-hour roads. We have to stop and go, stop and go, stop and go. A trip to Knoxville used to take all day, and still will if you go up 411. If you take I-75, you can get there in 4 hours and use a whole lot less gasoline and pollute the air a whole lot less. If any of you disagree with that, your opinions are welcome. But again, your author is promoting the view that we might have to curb our energy consumption and basically weaken ourselves. Now, there was still a lot of poverty. Yeah, I believe your book says that 1/3 of all children during Eisenhower's 8 years grew up in poverty. I was one of them. And being in poverty, you go to school and think everybody there is dressed nicer than you are. This was when kids actually tried to dress up. The girls all wore dresses, pantsuits were not legal. And you think everybody is better than you, but then eventually you learn that, hey, some people are poorer than you are. When I was in the Army, there was an older man who had rejoined after being out for a few years. He said, no matter how badly you think you're having it, somebody is having it worse than you are. And in most cases, folks, that's true. Other people did have it worse than I did. But anyway, one thing he did do when polio started spreading, he did give federal money to vaccinate people against polio, including the poor. Yes, I received a polio shot. And note, before Jonas Salk invented the shot, the pill taken in my mouth, you had to have 3 polio shots. You'd have one taken, come back in 30 days and have shot number 2, wait 7 months and go back and have shot number 3. Yeah, I had them. No, I never got polio, even though my parents would scare me to death thinking I'd someday get it. I'd had dreams I'd caught it, but never actually got it. But some people I knew did, a few. But anyway, polio made a comeback, and it still was crippling. Eisenhower continued to contain, Truman had tried containment. He built up nuclear weapons. Now, here's what got him a bad reputation. And folk, I remember this. In 1956, Hungary revolted. That's when my dad explained to me that Russia was bigger than we were, had more people than we did, had more weapons. He didn't know at the time that their weapons did not all work, but nevertheless, it looked like they had a bigger, and I pictured Russia as being like the bully on the block, bigger than everybody else, and could do what they wanted to. Anyway, the Hungarians revolted, thinking that the United States could come in and help. Eisenhower was afraid of nuclear war. He did not help. Now, some people have said that Ike was he'd seen so much war that he determined, now that I'm president, we're just not going to have war. So he refused to make it, and they got to making it look like America be pushed around. And a lot of people said, America should not be pushed around. And led Kennedy to say, we have become a nation of softies, of fat, lazy people, but we're going to proceed to fight now. And got us involved. Now, Eisenhower, when he left office, he was rated as a very mediocre president. Who did the ratings? Liberal college professors. And they rated a president on how much liberal, socialistic, communistic legislation he passed, of which I passed none. But as time went on, Eisenhower's approval rating has gotten higher and higher. Why? Because after we went through Kennedy and the Bay of Pigs, Johnson and Vietnam, Nixon and Watergate, Ford and inflation, and Carter and more inflation and outright incompetence, Eisenhower started looking better and better and better when compared to those presidents. Today he's looked on as being perhaps an above average president and realized that what he did by sitting there and doing nothing was actually what the situation called for at the time. The people of Hungary had no reason to believe that we were going to move in and help them. They acted on their own and they got crushed. But today Hungary is independent of Russia. Today Czechoslovakia is independent. Today Poland is independent. Today the two Germanys are united. These problems got solved with time. Now, in Vietnam, Eisenhower was asked by the French, will you please give us troops to help us fight those Vietnamese? Eisenhower wouldn't. As you know, Kennedy and Johnson did. I could not help. He said that Vietnam is not that much of an issue, not worth fighting for. He didn't help them. Now, in the case of Guatemala, now south of the border, Guatemala elected a president. Eisenhower helped overthrow the elected president because this elected president was known to be leaning towards communism like Castro had done. Eisenhower helped overthrow the elected president and installed a dictator in place. Now, folks, this is real, and I'm not getting mixed up on what happened. The result, though, was a civil war that Guatemala was to fight for a good many, many years. Eventually, things settled down in Guatemala. And a lot of it might be the United States. Actually, folks, none of us know what we do. And the job of being president is undoable. Just like I said, the job of being a public school teacher today is undoable. The job of being president is practically undoable. In Cuba, Castro took over Cuba. Fidel Castro took over Cuba, and he was to govern Cuba from then till the day he died. Now, the United States sent teams of men in to try to assassinate Castro. All the plots failed. Castro eventually died, and his brother Raul took over, and Raul Castro still governs Cuba to this day. When the United States would not cooperate with Castro and wouldn't trade with Castro, Castro turned to Moscow and got its help from Moscow. Eisenhower took in a bunch of Cuban refugees, and they still live in Miami, or at least their children do. Eisenhower began to train these refugees to go in and take over Cuba. He didn't do it himself. Ike didn't do it himself. The next president, Kennedy, sent these refugees into Cuba, and the result was disaster. Well, in the meantime, if that weren't enough, the Soviet Union fired their first intercontinental ballistic missile. This was terrifying the United States because an ICBM, as they're called, intercontinental, means a missile that can fly over an ocean from one continent to another. Right now it's a big issue because we're afraid that North Korea's dictator is going to soon develop an ICBM, and we don't want him to have one, even though today we have missiles that can supposedly knock these things out of the air. But nevertheless, the Soviets fired the first ICBM, and then 2 months later, they launched the world's first satellite called Sputnik. And this really, I mean, I'm old enough to remember, this really upsets people. The United States planned to fire its first satellite in 1958. The Russians fired their first satellite in 1957, before we got ours up. However, it wasn't as bad as it seemed because Eisenhower quickly learned that our technology was better than theirs. Now, it is true. They got into space before we did. They sent a man into orbit before we did. But they wound up losing the race to the moon. because from the very beginning their technology was behind ours. We beat them in micro technology and in sophistication. Now that might not be true now in 2019, but it was in 1958 and 59. As far as being the first man into space, yes they did. His name was Gagarin. Beat us by a few months, but here's how they did it, folk. They sent 8 cosmonauts up and lost them all 8. But Gagarin was the 9th one, and they all would have finally got one to go up and come down. Now, personally, I'd almost call that cheating. They sent their men up before they were ready to and lost them all. They would send us pictures of their cosmonauts. And one day we noticed a certain cosmonaut was picture, so we asked, where's cosmonaut so-and-so? And the Russians changed their story about him 3 times. He was their best cosmonaut. One time he was involved in a drunken barroom brawl and had to quit because he got hurt too badly. Another time he got drunk and was involved in an automobile accident. If you know about anything about the Russians and drinking, a lot of the Russians drink, and a lot of the Russians drink a lot. If I'm wrong, tell me. Anybody? Nobody? A lot of Russians drink a lot. But they finally admitted he was deceased. Well, we now know they sent him into orbit before they were ready to, and he perished in space. Yes, they did get the first man into orbit successfully and brought him down, but at a terrible price, a bigger price than we paid. And in the long run, they never have put a man on the moon. Now, in the meantime, Eisenhower responded by creating NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, which still exists, NASA. Now, I'll tell you something though, now here of late, our space program is becoming more and more privatized. Buzz Aldrin, who was part of the crew that went to the moon the first time, hates that, but I say more power to them. A private firm can oftentimes do a better job than the government has to go through all kinds of red tape and wait for Congress to fund it. In the case of a private firm, if somebody at the top decides we're going to Mars, if he can do it, we'll go to Mars. Lyndon Johnson said, after we got the moon, said, we're not going to Mars. Good thing we didn't, we weren't ready to, but that's something else. I still don't think we are. 2 big problems. Number 1, what weightlessness does to the human body is devastating to the human body, and number 2, radiation. We have no way to control the radiation that we might encounter. Anyway, now, in 1959, we flew a U-2 spy plane over the Soviet Union. If you know anything about the U-2, it has a huge, huge wingspan, and it can get really high. Well, our man was Francis Gary Powell, was over the Soviet Union fly. He ran into some mechanical problems with the plane and had to come down. He was supposed to have taken a needle, injected his own needle and died. That was his training. Now, none of us know what we do, but he did not inject himself. When the Soviets said, we have your U-2 airplane, Eisenhower just assumed that Gary Powers was dead. So he acted, that was not our plane and we didn't send it and we don't know anything about it. Next day, the Soviet Union proved with convincing proof, I mean irrefutable proof, that Francis Gary Powers was very much alive. And Ike was terribly embarrassed, to say the least. Well, Ike met with Khrushchev a few days later, 4 leaders, the President of France, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Khrushchev, and Ike met to discuss disarmament. The meeting lasted a few minutes, and finally Ike couldn't take any more of Khrushchev's insults and got up and walked out. Big summit conference, big blow up. Brought on largely by the U-2 incident. All right. The large farm replaced the small farm, and personally I know about this because a lot of my relatives were small farmers and they were forced out of the farming business and had to do something else. A lot of them were made. My Uncle Horace got a job in construction. Catch this close. I remember my mother reading a letter she got from her sister, Aunt Bessie, Uncle Horace's wife. And she told me, your Uncle Horace has gotten a job in a pipe welding firm making $3.40 an hour. That was a lot of money in those days, folk. That was more than your steel, but we're making $3.40 an hour. That was a lot. Today, That's below, that was back when the minimum wage was $1 an hour, by the way. He was making almost 3.5 times the minimum wage. Television came into widespread use. Television was invented in 1920, was not in much use during the Depression years, and even the stations that were on the air will be on the air maybe about 3 or 4 hours a day to give news and weather, and everybody knew to watch TV, you know, when the business day was over. Otherwise, the TV stations were quiet. But things changed in 1949, owing to the fact that TVs could be bought on the installment plan. Now, you could buy a television for $100 if you could pay cash for it. Or you could buy an installment plan and make payments of $10 a month for 12 months, 1 year. Now, most of you should know what I'm talking about here. Again, folks, there are times when you just cannot buy any other way than on credit. And if you really need a car, most of you will have to borrow the money to get one. Even though if you could pay for it in cash, it'd be cheaper. If you need to buy a house, most of you probably wind up paying on the installment plan. But again, TVs became very, it happened suddenly. The year I was born, 1949, by 1950, almost every American home had a TV. And TV, now in those days, TVs were black and white. The quality of the picture was terrible. Those pictures would tend to roll, boom, 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 I mean, go up and down. Some of you might have no idea what I'm talking about. But, or they sometimes roll up or roll down, and very difficult to stabilize the picture. Some of you do know what I'm talking about. Those old black and white TVs, eventually as technology improved, they needed a lot of repairs, and TV repairmen became a very thriving business. Now today, there are no TV repairmen anymore, hardly any left. If your TV breaks, you scrap it. Buy a new one. But anyway, that was then. TV became, like I say, in every American home. They would give news, weather, and a lot of shows. Tom Corbett's Space Cadet was popular in 1950-51, but mysteriously these shows had a way of coming, staying about a year or two, and then vanishing. Come around, stay about a year or two, and then vanish. That still goes on today. TV watching is becoming far less and less popular, again, owing to the laptop computer, the desktop. People began moving into the suburbs. Now, the South. The South boomed in your book credits air conditioners. This room is nice and cool right now. If it weren't for the air conditioner, folk, hate to think what this class would feel like. When I first went to UT in 1971, their main library was not air conditioned. And it got extremely stuffy in there. Now, by the time I graduated in 4 years, 1975, it was air conditioned, and it was much more tolerable. But to air condition that library cost the school hundreds of thousands of dollars. But eventually it was done. But again, today, almost every big building in the South, every business is air conditioned, every department store air conditioned. And yes, Lockheed, after a while, air conditioned its big facility there in Marietta. The year was 1997. They felt like they could get more work out of their workers if it were air conditioned than they could before, and they were probably right. Much leisure time in those days was spent watching television. The popular show in those days, and if it was the Western. You'd watch Westerns, and oh yeah, in those days, they didn't have UHF, so the TVs only had channels 2 through channel 11. And most families might get channels 2 and 5 and 8, or another family might get channel 3 and 7 and 11. But most of the time, the kids would all be watching the same show and come to school the next day talking about the show they watched last night, which most of the time was the same show. Because again, there were just so few shows to pick from. Now today, there's so much on TV that you can't watch it all. You know, so it's somewhat going out of style. But the Western, oh yeah, who were the Western heroes? The Long Ranger, Hopalong Cassidy, Wagon Train, Jefferson Drum, Wyatt Earp, Batmaster's Son. Any of you have ever seen any of these shows? Bonanza. A few of you might have seen a few of them. The Western has gone out by the wayside now, pretty much. But if you watch MeTV, you'll still hold the Rifleman. That was the one that lasted the longest. But it quit when young Mark was no longer a little kid. He got to be 15 and he couldn't play the role of the little boy kid anymore. The rifleman kind of went by the wayside also. Also, the dad, Lucas McCain, got another job. Now, anybody know what I'm talking about? Nobody. All right, nobody. Okay. Anyway, it's just, I mean, hey, little boys grow up, little girls grow up. You know. Shirley Temple was a really popular actress when she was 7 years old, but she grew up. Couldn't play the role of the little girl anymore. Kinsey published a book about human sexuality. Alfred Kinsey. He made it sound like everybody committed adultery. We now know that a lot of his work was unscientific and he wound up being criticized for it, but he was like the first person to pioneer sexuality. Now it's difficult to tell what percentage of people do commit adultery because most of the time it's done in secret, and people who do try hard to keep it secret, but and in a lot of cases you're found out, and I've been told that the day you're found out is a day in your life that you will never forget. Anyway. He also said that 10% of the population was homosexual. This number has been greatly reduced since. Again, he did not deal with a real sample of the regular population. Brown versus the Board of Education, a Supreme Court decision. Oops, that's a V. Brown versus the Board of Education said that separate but equal that had been established with Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 and had no place. Now, all the justices who had made the 1896 decision were dead and buried by the time of the 1954 decision. Sometimes that's the only way a bad court decision can get overturned. A new generation of justices overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. Brown versus Board of Education said that separate but equal has no place, and therefore public schools had to admit black students. All right, folks, I've got to jump around in the story a little bit. Today's public schools, at least in the South, are more segregated than they ever have been, but it's done by choice, not mandate. The black parents chose to send their kids to black schools rather than send their kids to mixed schools, for whatever reasons. But again, they had the free choice. But in those days, it was mandated, and the black schools were always inferior to the white schools. Inferior as far as the grounds, the buildings, the repairs on the buildings, always below the level of the white schools. But anyway, Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court said that racial discrimination was no longer legal. Eisenhower did not really want to enforce that, even though the law said he had to. A young man named Emmett Till. Now, I asked the other class, how many ever heard of Emmett Till? Okay, much more of you. Maybe that's why you make better grades. You know this stuff more already than my other class. But Emmett Till was a white man from Mississippi, or a young man from he was from Chicago. He visited Mississippi because he had relatives. They warned him when he got to Mississippi, you can't do like you do in Chicago. This is the South. Allegedly, he whistled at a married white woman. For this, he was killed. Now, many, many years later, this white woman said he never really whistled at her, but I don't know why she didn't speak up. Well, it could have made a difference. Anyway, he whistled at a white woman. The case made worldwide news. The persons who were tried for the crime were tried by an all-white jury and acquitted. And later, they all told the New York Times that, yes, we really did kill the man. Killed him at Till. The case went all the way through the legal system, got up to the Attorney General. The Attorney General said, this is too hot for me to handle. So the Attorney General passed the buck on to President Eisenhower. President Eisenhower said, we're not going to do anything about this. And let it go. So the whites who killed Emmett Till got away with murder. But their names have been tarnished from that day till this. Now, in the meantime, in Little Rock, and I remember this. Some black students tried to enroll in a white school. The governor of Arkansas, Faubus by name, Governor Faubus, called out the National Guard to keep the black students from enrolling. Well, Eisenhower at least acted, but Eisenhower federalized the National Guard. As president, he had a right to do. I mean, the president's commander-in-chief of all military. So Eisenhower federalized the National Guard, but at least he didn't tell the National Guard to protect the black students. Well, in the meantime, then, probably once the National Guard was not there, black students out, white students got riled up, and they confronted the blacks. Now, eventually the black students got into Little Rock School, but not without a lot of turmoil. Now, eventually, years went by, and some of these white students who had been involved in the Little Rock incident apologized to black and said, "We did not know any better. We were following the lead of our parents. Our parents told us you should not be admitted, but we now realize we were wrong." So some of the whites that were involved have apologized since. Now, Rosa Parks. Now, folk, I had a student tell me this morning that Rosa Parks was sitting in the white section of the bus. I've been told she wasn't. Here's the story. Rosa Parks was a young woman who'd had a hard day at work. She got on a bus, like she always did, and she sat in the black section. But in those days, the blacks sat on the back of the bus and the whites sat in the front. And there was a dividing line. Everybody knew which was the white section, which was the black section. Rosa Parks sat, and as I understand, if you know different, you're welcome to know, but she sat in the black section, but she sat in the front row of the black section. Well, a white man got on the bus, and he looked around and he saw no seats in the white section. So he told Rosa Parks that she had to get up because she had to stand. He was white and he had the privilege, and she had to stand up. Rosa Parks said, "I am not standing up for you. I'm in my own black section. I'm a woman, and you're a man. You should stand up." This led to turmoil. The blacks got together and boycotted Southern buses. They got together, they carpooled anything they could to get themselves where they needed to go without the aid of buses. They boycotted the buses, and the man who led the boycotts was Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King Jr. was from Atlanta. Maybe all of you know that. He advocated peaceful resistance. He led the boycotts. The fight went on for a long time, and eventually it led to where the buses, public transportation, was integrated.